On the morning of March 18, 1896, 14-year-old Thomas Ridley left his mother's modest timber house in Silver Creek, Utah, to fetch water from the frozen creek that gave the settlement its name. He never returned alive. When a search party found his body 3 hours later, wedged between ice sheets near the old mill ruins, the men who discovered him would later tell their wives they had never seen anything like it. The boy's chest had been torn open with such force that his ribs protruded through his wool coat. His throat bore marks that Dr. Cornelius Webb, the town's only physician, would describe in his official report as lacerations inconsistent with any known predator in the Utah Territory. But it was Thomas's face that haunted the men who carried him back to town. His eyes wide open, frozen in an expression that suggested he had seen his killer and recognized it. Welcome to this journey into one of the most disturbing chapters of American frontier history. Before we begin, I invite you to share with us in the comments below. Where are you watching from, and what time is it where you are right now? This story connects us across time and space, and I'd love to know where our community is gathering today. The year 1896 was a time of transformation in the American West. Utah had achieved statehood only months before, in January, joining the Union as the 45th state after decades of territorial status. Silver Creek was a community of approximately 340 residents, nestled in a narrow valley between the Wasatch Range Mountains, accessible only by a single dirt road that became impassable during winter months. The settlement had grown around a silver mining operation that had proven less profitable than hoped, leaving behind a population of farmers, a handful of merchants, and families too poor or too stubborn to move elsewhere. The community was predominantly Mormon, as was common in Utah settlements of the period, though a few non-Mormon families had settled there as well. The Ridley family, Sarah Ridley and her son Thomas, were among these outsiders, having arrived from Pennsylvania 3 years prior after Sarah's husband died in a mining accident. They were tolerated but never fully integrated into the tight-knit religious community. This detail would later prove significant. When Thomas Ridley's mutilated body was brought to Dr. Webb's office above the general store, the physician conducted an examination that left him deeply troubled. His handwritten notes preserved in the Summit County archives describe wounds that appeared to have been inflicted by an animal of considerable size and strength. Yet the pattern of trauma suggests a level of focused violence inconsistent with predatory behavior. Webb noted that while the wounds resembled those made by large claws or teeth, the boy's body showed signs of what he termed deliberate mutilation rather than the feeding frenzy of a hungry animal. Sheriff Elijah Harlow, a 42-year-old former ranch hand who had held the position for 6 years, initially suspected a mountain lion. Such attacks, while rare, were not unheard of in the isolated valleys of Utah. He organized a hunting party of 12 men to track the animal. But before they could begin their search, a second body was discovered. On March 23rd, just 5 days after Thomas Ridley's death, 67-year-old Margaret Foster was found dead in her chicken coop. The elderly widow lived alone on the eastern edge of town, and when she failed to appear at Sunday services, neighbors went to check on her. What they found suggested that whatever killed her had done so with even greater savagery than the attack on young Thomas. The chickens were untouched. The coop's door had been torn from its hinges, and Margaret Foster's body bore the same inexplicable wounds, tears in the flesh that seemed too precise to be random, too brutal to be human. It was after Margaret Foster's death that the word werewolf was first whispered in the streets of Silver Creek. The town's Reverend Isaiah Ashford would later write in his private diary that he tried to calm his congregation, reminding them that such superstitions had no place in rational minds. But fear, he noted, is not rational, and what happened next would test the faith of every person in that isolated valley. Because by April 1st, there would be 2 more bodies, and Sheriff Harlow would assemble not 12 men, but 23, for a hunt that would end with 4 men dead and secrets that Silver Creek's survivors would take to their graves. To understand what happened in Silver Creek in the spring of 1896, one must first understand the isolation and hardship that defined life in this remote corner of Utah. The settlement had been established in 1873 during the height of the Western mining boom, when prospectors discovered silver deposits in the surrounding mountains. Unlike the boom towns that exploded into existence with saloons, brothels, and thousands of fortune seekers, Silver Creek never grew beyond a modest collection of rough-hewn buildings clustered around a central dirt street. The Silver Creek Mining Company, based out of Salt Lake City, had funded the initial development, but by 1880 it became clear that the silver deposits were neither extensive nor easily accessible. The company abandoned its operations, leaving behind the skeletal remains of mining infrastructure and a population of families who had invested everything in the promise of prosperity. Those who remained turned to subsistence farming and logging, eking out a harsh existence in a valley where winter lasted 6 months and the growing season was unpredictable at best. The community's isolation was not merely geographical. During the winter months, typically November through March, the single road connecting Silver Creek to the larger town of Coleville, some 30 miles to the north, became impassable due to snow accumulation that could reach depths of 8 to 10 feet. Residents were entirely self-sufficient during these months, relying on stored provisions, hunting, and the tight social bonds that formed out of necessity rather than choice. Contemporary accounts from the period paint a picture of a community marked by quiet desperation and rigid social hierarchies. The majority Mormon population maintained their religious practices with an intensity that outsiders found unsettling. The weekly services at the small meeting house were not optional. Absence was noted and questioned. Reverend Isaiah Ashford, who had been called to serve the Silver Creek congregation in 1894, kept meticulous records of attendance and conducted regular visits to member families to ensure doctrinal compliance and moral rectitude. The non-Mormon families, the Ridleys, the Fosters, the Whitcombs, and a few others, existed on the periphery of community life. They were allowed to purchase goods at the general store and could seek medical attention from Dr. Webb, but they were excluded from the social gatherings and mutual aid networks that formed the backbone of Mormon community life. This segregation, common throughout Utah territory, created an environment where suspicion could flourish and where those outside the religious mainstream could easily become scapegoats in times of crisis. One family existed even further removed from the town's social fabric: the Dunmores. Jacob Dunmore, his wife Ruth, and their 3 adult sons lived on a remote farmstead approximately 5 miles north of Silver Creek proper, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through dense pine forest. The Dunmores had arrived in the area around 1875, purchasing a parcel of marginal land that previous settlers had abandoned. They appeared in town infrequently, perhaps once every few months, to purchase supplies, and rebuffed all attempts at neighborly interaction. Local folklore, recorded in letters and diaries from the period, suggested that the Dunmores were touched by something dark. Rumors circulated that they practiced strange rituals, that they kept to themselves because they were hiding something shameful, that their isolation was not by choice, but by necessity. Jacob Dunmore was described in one contemporary account as a man of unusual size and strength, with eyes that reflected light in an unnatural manner. His sons were said to be equally large and equally unsociable. It's important to note that such descriptions, written in an era of superstition and limited scientific understanding, must be viewed with skepticism. The Dunmores may have simply been a family that valued privacy, perhaps fleeing some past trouble in another territory, perhaps simply preferring the solitude of frontier life. But in the context of what was about to happen in Silver Creek, these rumors would transform into something far more dangerous. Dr. Cornelius Webb, whose medical practice served the community, kept detailed patient records that survive in fragmentary form. Among these records are notes indicating that he had treated Jacob Dunmore for a peculiar affliction of the skin in 1894, though the specifics of the condition are not described. Webb also noted that the Dunmore family exhibited unusual physical characteristics, possibly hereditary in nature, but provided no further elaboration. These cryptic medical observations would later fuel speculation about the family's possible involvement in the events that followed. The winter of 1895-1896 had been particularly brutal. Snowfall exceeded normal levels by nearly 40%, according to weather records maintained by the territorial government. Supplies ran low, and by February several families were rationing their food stores. Livestock losses were significant. Sheep and cattle that had not been properly sheltered froze to death, representing devastating financial losses for families already struggling at the edge of survival. It was against this backdrop of hardship, isolation, and simmering social tensions that Thomas Ridley walked to the creek on that March morning. The winter was finally receding. Ice was breaking up on the creek. Spring, with its promise of renewal and relief, seemed within reach. But what emerged from the melting snow would shatter whatever fragile hope the community still possessed. The death of Margaret Foster on March 23rd transformed fear into panic. If Thomas Ridley's killing could be rationalized as a tragic accident, a boy who wandered too far, encountered a mountain lion and paid the ultimate price, Margaret Foster's death obliterated any such comforting explanations. The scene at her chicken coop defied logic. The elderly woman had been found partially inside the structure, her body dragged halfway through the door as if the attacker had been interrupted or had simply lost interest. The chickens, as mentioned, were completely untouched and still alive, huddled in the far corner of the coop in a state of terror, but physically unharmed. This detail particularly troubled Sheriff Harlow, who noted in his official report, "No animal kills for sport. A mountain lion, bear, or wolf attacks to feed or to defend territory." The selective nature of these killings suggests a different motivation entirely. Dr. Webb's examination of Margaret Foster revealed wounds nearly identical to those found on Thomas Ridley's body. Deep lacerations to the throat and chest. Tissue trauma consistent with powerful jaws, yet without the tearing patterns typical of canine or feline predators. Most disturbing were the marks on her forearms. Defensive wounds indicating that she had raised her hands to protect herself and had seen her attacker approaching. Webb recorded that her fingers had been nearly severed, as if she had gripped something and was forcibly separated from it. The Sunday following Margaret Foster's death, Reverend Ashford addressed his congregation with words intended to provide comfort, but which instead revealed his own uncertainty. A transcript of his sermon, preserved in church records, includes the passage, "We live in an age of reason, brothers and sisters, yet we must acknowledge that there are forces in this world we do not fully comprehend. The wilderness that surrounds us is not empty. It holds mysteries that challenge our understanding. We must place our faith in the Lord's protection and remain vigilant against whatever darkness walks among us." His use of the phrase "walks among us" would later be cited as the moment when supernatural explanations gained legitimacy in the community's collective consciousness. On March 27th, a third victim was discovered. Henry Whitcomb, a 41-year-old logger, had left his home before dawn to check his trap lines in the forest south of town. When he didn't return by mid-afternoon, his wife raised the alarm. A search party found him approximately 2 miles from town, lying in a clearing near a cluster of large boulders. The manner of his death was identical to the previous victims: savage wounds to the throat and chest, defensive injuries on his hands and arms, and that same expression of recognition frozen on his face. But this time, there was additional evidence. The snow around Henry Whitcomb's body showed clear tracks. Sheriff Harlow, who had some experience with tracking from his ranching days, examined them carefully. His report, written in a notably shaken hand, describes prints resembling those of a large wolf or dog, but of unusual size and depth. The stride pattern suggests bipedal movement in some sections, quadrupedal in others. This is inconsistent with known animal behavior. The tracks led north, toward the Dunmore farmstead. Public sentiment turned immediately and decisively against the Dunmore family. On March 29th, a group of approximately 30 townspeople marched to Sheriff Harlow's office, demanding that he arrest Jacob Dunmore and his sons. According to the testimony of Deputy Charles Morrison, transcribed in county legal records, the crowd was highly agitated and spoke openly of taking justice into their own hands if the sheriff would not act. Harlow refused to make arrests without evidence. He did, however, agree to visit the Dunmore property to question the family. He took Deputy Morrison and 2 other men as witnesses. What they found there was recorded in an affidavit that would later become a key document in understanding the events that followed. The Dunmore farmhouse was, by all accounts, unremarkable, a simple 2-story structure, well maintained given the harsh conditions. The barn showed signs of regular use. Livestock appeared healthy. Jacob Dunmore received the sheriff cordially enough, though he made his displeasure at the visit clear. When questioned about his whereabouts during the times of the killings, Dunmore stated that he and his sons had been on their property, working their land and tending their animals. His wife Ruth confirmed this account. Sheriff Harlow asked to search the property. Dunmore refused, citing his rights as a landowner. The sheriff had no warrant and no legal grounds to insist. He could only note in his report that the Dunmore men are indeed of unusual physical stature, standing well over 6 feet in height with proportionate build. Their hands show signs of hard labor, but also bear scarring of an unusual nature, possibly from some form of chronic skin condition. As the sheriff's party prepared to leave, one of the men with them, William Hayes, a farmer, later testified that he heard sounds coming from inside the barn. Chains rattling, he would say in his statement, and something that might have been a low growl or moan. When I asked about it, Jacob Dunmore said it was just livestock, but I know livestock sounds, and that weren't no cow or horse I ever heard. The 4th victim was discovered on April 2nd, James Carpenter, a 28-year-old assistant to Dr. Webb, was found dead behind the doctor's office. This killing differed from the others in one crucial aspect. It occurred within the town proper, not on its outskirts or in the surrounding wilderness. The creature or person had grown bold enough to strike at the community's heart. Tell us in the comments what you think is happening so far. Is this the work of an animal, or is something else stalking the people of Silver Creek? Share your theories below. The discovery of James Carpenter's body occurred at a moment when Sheriff Harlow was preparing to organize a proper hunt. He had sent word to Colville requesting assistance from the territorial marshal, but with the road still difficult to traverse, no response had yet arrived. He couldn't wait any longer. On April 4th, Harlow posted notices throughout Silver Creek calling for volunteers to join an armed expedition. 23 men answered the call. They would depart on the evening of April 15th, timing their hunt for the full moon, which folk wisdom suggested would draw out whatever beast was responsible. But between April 4th and April 15th, something else happened that would not be recorded in any official document, something that would only come to light 71 years later when a water-damaged diary was discovered in the wall of the old meeting house during renovation work. And what Reverend Isaiah Ashford had written in that diary would suggest that the hunt for the Silver Creek werewolf was not what it appeared to be at all. The diary of Reverend Isaiah Ashford was discovered on July the 14th, 1967, by construction workers renovating the old Silver Creek meeting house, which by that time had been converted into a community center. The leather-bound journal had been sealed in a metal box and hidden within a hollow section of wall, preserved remarkably well despite the passage of more than 7 decades. The Summit County Historical Society took possession of the diary, and its contents were partially transcribed for academic study, though portions were deemed too disturbing for general circulation. The entries from April 1896 paint a picture far more complex and sinister than the official records suggest. On April 6th, Ashford wrote, "Sheriff Harlow came to me in confidence this evening after services. He has shared with me his true suspicions regarding the killings, and I confess myself torn between my duty to God and my duty to this community. What he proposes is an abomination, yet if he is correct in his theory, an even greater abomination has already been committed. I have prayed for guidance, but receive only silence." The entry for April 9th is more explicit. "I have examined the medical records that Dr. Webb reluctantly shared with me. The pattern of wounds is indeed consistent with what Harlow suspects, but the implications are monstrous. If the Dunmore family has been afflicted with rabies, as Harlow believes, then their continued residence so near. Our community represents an ongoing danger, yet rabies does not explain the calculated nature of these attacks, nor does it explain why the family has not shown visible symptoms. Webb mentioned his treatment of Jacob Dunmore 2 years ago for a skin condition. I pressed him for details. He finally admitted that the condition resembled nothing in medical literature, a periodic lesioning that occurred with the full moon, accompanied by violent fever and delirium. Webb treated it with silver, a nitrate solution, which seemed to provide temporary relief. The symbolism has not escaped me." On April 12th, Ashford made the entry that would prove most significant. "A delegation of town elders met with Sheriff Harlow and myself tonight. They included Samuel Porter, William Hayes, and Thomas Bridger. Porter spoke for the group. They know about the Dunmores. They have known for months, perhaps years. There is a history here that predates my arrival in Silver Creek, a secret that the original settlers have kept. Porter says the Dunmores came to this valley to hide, that they sought isolation because they knew what they carried in their blood. He spoke of a hereditary madness, a condition that transforms afflicted individuals during the full moon into creatures of violence and rage. He used the word lycanthropy without irony or shame. The others nodded in agreement. I asked why, if they knew this, they had allowed the family to remain. Porter said, "Because we made a deal with them. They stay on their land, and we stay on ours. The killings this spring break that deal. Something has changed." The April 13th entry reads simply, "God forgive us for what we're about to do." While Reverend Ashford was grappling with moral implications, Sheriff Harlow was gathering evidence. His investigation, conducted in the days before the hunt, produced several items that were catalogued but never publicly discussed. These items were discovered during a systematic search of the areas where victims had been found. Near the site of Thomas Ridley's death, searchers found tufts of coarse black hair caught on tree bark approximately 7 feet above the ground. Dr. Webb examined the hair under microscope and noted in his records that it was neither canine nor lupine in structure, exhibiting unusual thickness and a peculiar serrated pattern along the shaft. that I have not encountered in my study of animal specimens. At the location where Henry Whitcomb died, the search party discovered what appeared to be a makeshift shelter, a natural depression beneath an overhanging rock face that showed signs of recent occupation. Inside were the bones of small animals, gnawed and broken. There were also scraps of fabric that were later identified as having been torn from clothing matching garments owned by the Dunmore family. Most disturbing was a piece of rope, approximately 3 feet in length, with what appeared to be teeth marks at both ends and dark stains that tested positive for human blood when treated with Guaiac solution, a primitive test available to physicians of the era. On April 14th, the day before the organized hunt, Dr. Webb was examining these collected items in his office when he made a discovery that he immediately brought to Sheriff Harlow's attention. Among the fabric scraps was a piece of heavy cloth that appeared to have been part of a restraint, specifically a collar or harness designed for a large animal. The material showed extensive wear and had been reinforced with leather strips. More significantly, it bore a manufacturer's mark, indicating it had been custom ordered from a leather goods company in Denver. Harlow sent a telegram to Denver, inquiring about the purchase. The response arrived on the morning of April 15th. The harness had been ordered by Jacob Dunmore in 1894, designed to specifications requiring strength sufficient to restrain an adult bear. When questioned by telegraph about the purpose of such an item, the leather goods merchant reported that Dunmore had explained he was capturing and studying wildlife for scientific purposes. But there were no bears in the immediate vicinity of Silver Creek, and Jacob Dunmore had never claimed to be a scientist or naturalist. The harness suggested something else entirely. The Dunmores were not the predators, but rather were attempting to restrain one. On the afternoon of April 15th, just hours before the hunt was scheduled to begin, a young boy named Michael Porter, son of Samuel Porter, one of the town elders, came forward with information he had been afraid to share. Michael, aged 12, stated that he had seen something 3 weeks earlier while checking his family's rabbit snares in the forest. According to his testimony, given to Sheriff Harlow in the presence of his father, it was walking like a man but hunched over, and it was way too big. It had fur all over, but wore pieces of clothing, like pants torn up. I hid behind a tree, and it passed, maybe 20 feet from me. I could smell it like wet dog and something worse, like meat left in the sun. It stopped and turned its head toward me, and I saw its face. It wasn't a wolf face, Sheriff. It was a person's face, but wrong. The mouth was too big, and the eyes were yellow like a cat's. I ran and didn't stop running until I got home. I didn't tell nobody because I thought they'd say I was lying. Michael Porter's description matched details from several other testimonies that had been dismissed as hysteria or imagination. When taken together, they painted a portrait of something that existed in the liminal space between human and beast. At sunset on April 15th, 1896, 23 armed men assembled in front of the sheriff's office in Silver Creek. The full moon was rising, a pale disk in the darkening sky. Each man carried a rifle or shotgun. Many also carried pistols. Sheriff Elijah Harlow addressed the group with words that several participants would later recall in written accounts. "We are hunting something dangerous," Harlow said. "I won't insult your intelligence by pretending we're after a mountain lion. You've seen the bodies, you've heard the stories. Whatever we find tonight, we deal with it decisively. No one breaks formation, no one goes off alone. We move together and we watch each other's backs. If anyone wants to leave now, there's no shame in it." No one left. The group included Samuel Porter, William Hayes, Thomas Bridger, Deputy Charles Morrison, and 19 other men ranging in age from 19 to 56. Notably absent was Dr. Cornelius Webb, who remained in town to care for the injured should the hunt go badly. Reverend Ashford was present, though he carried no weapon. He later wrote that he came to bear witness and to pray for the souls of both hunters and hunted. The hunting party moved north along the trail toward the Dunmore farmstead, but Harlow's plan was not to confront the family directly. Instead, based on the track patterns and evidence collected, he intended to search the forest between the town and the Dunmore property. His theory, which he shared only with his closest confidants, was that one of the Dunmore family members, possibly one of the sons, suffered from the hereditary condition that caused periodic violent madness. The family had been attempting to manage the afflicted individual, but something had gone wrong. Perhaps the restraints had failed. Perhaps the condition had worsened. Whatever the case, Harlow believed they would find the killer in the forest rather than in the farmhouse. The hunt progressed slowly through the dense pine forest, with men spread in a line approximately 10 feet apart. They carried torches and lanterns, creating a moving line of light through the darkness. The forest was eerily quiet. Animals that would normally have been active at night, owls, foxes, rodents, were absent or silent. Several men later reported feeling that they were being watched, that something was tracking them even as they searched for it. Around 9 o'clock, approximately 3 hours into the hunt, the line of men reached a clearing near a creek bed. It was here that they found the first clear signs of their quarry. The ground showed obvious disturbance, earth torn up, branches broken, and a large area where something had bedded down. There was blood on the ground and on nearby trees. Fresh blood. Sheriff Harlow examined the scene with his lantern. According to Deputy Morrison's later testimony, the sheriff's hands were shaking as he pointed out details. Whatever was here, it's been feeding. Look at those bones, they're human ribs. And these scraps of cloth, that's from Margaret Foster's dress. This is where it's been bringing its kills. The men spread out to search the immediate area more thoroughly. It was Samuel Porter who found the cave, a natural opening in a rocky hillside, partially concealed by undergrowth. The entrance was approximately 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, large enough for a man to crawl through if he crouched. Scratch marks gouged the rock around the entrance. The smell emanating from within was overpowering, a mixture of decay, excrement, and something else that multiple witnesses described as sulphurous or like burning hair. Harlow called for volunteers to enter the cave. 5 men stepped forward, including Deputy Morrison and Thomas Bridger. They lit additional torches and prepared to descend into the darkness. The cave entrance sloped downward at a steep angle, and within a few feet the men were crawling on hands and knees. The testimony of those who entered describes a tunnel that extended approximately 30 feet before opening into a larger chamber. What they found in that chamber would never be fully documented in official records. Deputy Morrison's statement, given 2 weeks after the events, mentions remains of multiple victims, both human and animal, and evidence of prolonged occupation by something that lived in conditions of absolute savagery. Thomas Bridger was more specific in a letter he wrote to his brother in 1897. "We found what I can only describe as a lair. Human bones were piled in corners, scraps of clothing, personal items taken from victims, and chains, heavy chains bolted into the rock walls. Whatever had been kept there had broken free. The chains were snapped, not unlocked. Something with incredible strength had torn them apart. But the lair was empty. Whatever they were hunting was not there, and that's when the screaming started from the forest above. The official record states that 4 men died during the hunt on April 15, 1896. Their names were William Hayes, age 39, Martin Fletcher, age 42, Robert Sullivan, age 23, and Thomas Bridger, age 51. The circumstances of their deaths were listed as killed during pursuit of dangerous predator. No further details were provided. The 19 survivors returned to Silver Creek shortly after midnight, and by noon the following day, Sheriff Elijah Harlow had resigned his position. He left Utah within the week and was never heard from again. What actually happened during those hours between the discovery of the lair and the return of the survivors was obscured by a wall of silence that would endure for generations. The men who lived through that night took an oath never to speak of what they had witnessed, and with only a handful of exceptions, they kept that promise until their deaths. Reverend Isaiah Ashford's diary entries end abruptly on April 16th. His final entry reads, "We have done something unforgivable. I cannot put into words what occurred. I can only pray that God's judgment is swift, for I deserve no mercy. The town has agreed to the story we will tell, but the truth is carved into my soul, and I will carry it to my grave." The Dunmore family disappeared. Their farmhouse was found abandoned on April 17th when a group of townspeople went to investigate. The house showed signs of a hasty departure, but no violence. Livestock had been released from their pens. Personal belongings were left behind. Most significantly, the barn contained evidence that would perplex investigators for decades. The floor was covered in silver dust and ash. Chemical analysis performed much later would suggest a mixture of silver nitrate, sulfur, and organic compounds, consistent with burned animal tissue. But in 1896, the substance was simply noted, and then buried along with everything else associated with the Dunmore property. The killings stopped immediately after the night of April 15th. No further attacks occurred in Silver Creek or the surrounding region. The official explanation, published in the Salt Lake Tribune on April 28, 1896, stated that a rabid wolf had been killed by hunters and the threat to the community had been eliminated. No wolf corpse was ever produced. No taxidermist ever prepared a trophy. The story was accepted because people wanted to believe it, and because the alternative was unthinkable. For 60 years, Silver Creek existed as a quiet, unremarkable mountain community. The events of 1896 became local legend, discussed in whispers, but never investigated seriously. The meeting house, where Reverend Ashford had preached, was eventually abandoned as the congregation dwindled, then was sold to the county and converted into storage space, then finally slated for renovation as a community center in the 1960s. The discovery of Ashford's diary in 1967 coincided with a renewed interest in frontier history and the emerging field of folklore studies. Dr. Patricia Hammond, a historian at the University of Utah, obtained permission to study the diary and began conducting interviews with descendants of the original Silver Creek families. Her research, published in a limited edition academic journal in 1973, uncovered several additional pieces of evidence that had been overlooked or suppressed. Among Dr. Hammond's most significant findings was a set of letters exchanged between Dr. Cornelius Webb and a physician colleague in Boston in 1897. In these letters, Webb described his treatment of Jacob Dunmore and mentioned his belief that the family suffered from a hereditary neurological condition that manifested in periodic episodes of violent psychosis, possibly triggered by lunar cycles affecting brain chemistry. He also noted his suspicion that one family member, likely the youngest son, was severely afflicted and had escaped the family's attempts at containment. This medical opinion, grounded in the limited scientific understanding of the era, provides a rational explanation for what superstitious townspeople interpreted as lycanthropy. However, Webb's letters also contain passages that resist easy rationalization. He wrote, "I examined the body of one of the men killed during the hunt, William Hayes. His wounds were identical to those found on the earlier victims. This suggests that whatever killed Hayes was the same entity responsible for the previous deaths. But Hayes was killed after the hunters had discovered the lair, which means the creature actively pursued and attacked armed men who were hunting it. This implies intelligence and strategic thinking far beyond what we would expect from even the most rabid animal or deranged human. In 1979, a local historian named Martin Keller gained access to the sealed portions of Sheriff Harlow's case files, which had been stored in the Summit County Courthouse basement. Among these documents was a sketch, a crude drawing made by Deputy Morrison on April 16, 1896. The sketch depicted something bipedal but hunched, with elongated limbs and a misshapen head. Accompanying text stated, "What we saw in the forest stood approximately 8 feet tall when upright, covered in dark fur or hair. Face appeared human but distorted, with protruding jaw and enlarged canines, moved with unnatural speed. Required multiple gunshots to bring down. We burned the remains as agreed." This sketch has never been officially authenticated, and skeptics argue it may have been a later fabrication, but its existence, along with the other fragmentary evidence, suggests that something extraordinary did occur in Silver Creek in 1896, and that the community's conspiracy of silence was motivated by more than simple embarrassment or superstition. One final piece of evidence emerged in 1985, when renovation work at the old Silver Creek Cemetery uncovered an unmarked mass grave containing the remains of at least 6 individuals. Forensic analysis dated the burial to approximately the late 1890s. The bones showed extensive trauma consistent with violent death. Most peculiarly, several skulls exhibited unusual morphological features, enlarged jaw structures, unusually robust teeth, and bone density inconsistent with normal human skeletal development. The county coroner at the time, Dr. Samuel Richardson, noted these anomalies but could offer no explanation. The remains were reburied with a simple marker reading "Unknown, 1896. Were these the victims of the Silver Creek killings, or were they the killers themselves, the Dunmore family, executed by vigilantes and buried in secret? DNA analysis, which might have provided answers, was not performed due to ethical concerns about disturbing the graves further. The mystery remains unresolved. In 1992, the last living person who had direct knowledge of the 1896 events passed away. Emily Morrison, daughter of Deputy Charles Morrison, was 93 years old. In her final weeks, she spoke to a local journalist about her father's experiences. She reported that he had nightmares for the rest of his life, always occurring on nights with full moons. He would wake screaming about yellow eyes in the darkness and the sound it made when it died, like a man crying out in agony. Emily also mentioned that her father kept a silver bullet on a chain around his neck, which he claimed had been fired during the hunt but had been recovered later. When Emily tried to keep the bullet after his death, she found it had been buried with him. The journalist who conducted this interview, Rebecca Stone, attempted to locate the grave and exhume the body to verify the existence of the bullet, but the cemetery records for Deputy Morrison's burial site were incomplete, and his grave was never definitively identified. Today, Silver Creek is a ghost town. The last permanent residents left in the 1970s when the county closed the local school. The buildings remain, slowly decaying, visited occasionally by tourists interested in frontier history and paranormal enthusiasts seeking evidence of the werewolf legend. The Dunmore farmstead has long since collapsed, reclaimed by the forest. The cave where the lair was discovered has never been located by modern investigators. Its exact position was never officially recorded, and the handful of people who knew its location took that knowledge to their graves. More than a century has passed since the events of April 1896 in Silver Creek, Utah. The physical evidence has decayed, the witnesses have died, and the truth has been obscured by layers of legend, suppression, and time's inexorable erosion of memory. What remains are fragments, diary entries, medical records, sketches, and the testimony of people whose reliability cannot be verified. From these fragments, we must attempt to construct an understanding of what happened in that isolated mountain valley during one terrible spring. 3 theories have emerged among historians and researchers who have studied the Silver Creek case. Each has its adherents, and each raises as many questions as it answers. The first theory is medical in nature. It proposes that the Dunmore family suffered from a rare hereditary condition, possibly porphyria, hypertrichosis, or a neurological disorder not yet fully understood by medical science. Such conditions can cause skin sensitivity, excessive hair growth, behavioral changes, and in extreme cases, violent episodes. The family's isolation was an attempt to manage this condition away from the judgment and fear of others. When one family member, perhaps the youngest son, experienced a severe episode, he escaped confinement and attacked people in the area before being tracked down and killed by the hunting party. The community, unwilling to admit they had executed a mentally ill person, constructed the werewolf narrative as a cover story. This theory explains most of the physical evidence and aligns with the rational medical thinking of Dr. Webb. The second theory is sociological. It suggests that the Dunmore family were scapegoats, targeted by a community already on edge due to isolation, hardship, and religious tension. The killings may have been committed by one or more townspeople, perhaps someone suffering from undiagnosed mental illness, perhaps someone with a grudge against the victims. When suspicion fell on the Dunmores due to their status as outsiders, the town's leadership decided to use them as convenient villains. The hunting party may have murdered the entire Dunmore family and disposed of their bodies, then invented the story about killing a creature to justify their actions. The conspiracy of silence was maintained to protect the murderers from legal consequences. This theory explains the rapid disappearance of the Dunmore family and the complete lack of physical evidence of any creature. The third theory is supernatural. It accepts at face value the testimony and evidence suggesting that the Dunmore family harbored an individual afflicted with genuine lycanthropy, a curse, disease, or genetic anomaly that transformed them into something neither fully human nor fully animal. This theory requires acceptance of phenomena outside the boundaries of conventional science, but its adherents point to the consistency of eyewitness descriptions, the unusual nature of the wounds inflicted on victims, the skeletal anomalies found in the mass grave, and the absolute conviction with which witnesses spoke about what they had seen. They note that folklore across cultures includes similar stories of shape-shifting, suggesting these legends may be rooted in rare but real occurrences that science has not yet explained. Which theory is correct? The evidence does not allow for a definitive conclusion. Each theory accounts for some facts while leaving others unexplained. What we know with certainty is limited. 4 people were killed in Silver Creek in early 1896 under circumstances that terrified the community. 23 armed men hunted something in the forest on the night of April 15th. 4 of those men died. The survivors refused to speak about what they had encountered. The Dunmore family disappeared and was never seen again, and the attacks stopped as suddenly as they had begun. To this day, no one knows the truth of what stalked Silver Creek in the spring of 1896. The forest where the hunt occurred still stands, largely unchanged. The cave where the lair was discovered remains hidden somewhere in those mountains. And on certain nights, when the moon is full and the wind moves through the pines just right, locals say you can still hear sounds that might be wolves howling, or might be something else entirely. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you for joining me on this journey into one of America's darkest historical mysteries. This is the kind of story that haunts me because it sits at the intersection of documented history and the unknown. Before you go, I'd like to ask you to do 3 things. First, subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our future investigations into forgotten horrors. Second, let me know in the comments which theory you find most convincing. Was it a medical condition, a conspiracy, or something supernatural? And third, share your own stories or local legends from your area. Our community thrives on these shared mysteries, and your contributions make this channel what it is. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and remember that history is full of shadows where the light has yet to reach. Some of those shadows may be better left undisturbed, but we'll keep searching for the truth anyway. Thank you for listening.